The tracks were the first thing I noticed before anything else. Two raw lines cut into the dust like a promise and a threat. Dawn had just pushed the sun up and the air tasted like metal and old tire rubber. I put my hand on the ute's cold roof and felt the vibration of my own pulse against my palm. I watched the tire ram marks run straight as a plumb line across the gibber and the salt crust toward the Marree Man. They were fresh. I could tell by the way the dust had settled back into the tread, filling some hollows and leaving others sharp. I could tell by the thin pale ribbon where the crust had sheared and where the tire had skidded. Whoever had come through here had driven low and deliberate, not the aimless zigzaggers we sometimes saw passing through. They'd gone straight to the geoglyph, stopped, then driven off toward the dune line like someone had given them a clear instruction and a narrow window to obey. From the ute, the figure lay flat on the plain, a dark human silhouette cut into salt and soil. The Marree Man had always felt like something carved for the sky, and that morning he looked both public and private at once. The new tracks crossed old maintenance ruts and stopped at the thigh, as if someone had leaned over and looked under something. Beneath the Marree Man something shouldn't be there, and the thought set my nerves on edge, in a way a gust of wind never quite managed. I had walked over that figure half my life, patched the marker pegs out by the road and fixed busted water pumps on the private runs that cut through its lines. My hands knew the ribbed gravel of the place, and still my brain registered the tracks as a fault in the skin. The idea lodged itself like a splinter and didn't let me forget it. I was half station hand, half handyman, and both halves kept me honest. My arms were sunburned from rope, and spanner and wrench, marked with grease that wouldn't come off no matter how many mornings I tried. I could start a diesel that wasn't keen on waking, and coax a pump back into life, when money and time were both tight. I wasn't a man with degrees or taste for grand theories. I was the sort of bloke who balanced a bill of materials until the numbers fit. Still, I had a curiosity that wasn't entirely practical, a fly at the corner of an eye that kept nibbling. It scraped at me at odd hours and had pulled me out of bed before the sun more than once in my life. Bills followed me like a steady shadow: rent near the roadhouse, parts for the ute, a loan I hadn't wanted in Adelaide, a medical bill left nagging because my brother had shredded the last of my resolve. That morning the curiosity tugged hard enough to make me walk across hard ground. I was in Marree because Mick needed an extra pair of hands. He was the station owner, solid as a slab of salted beef, and he ran things close-mouthed and precise. The station had taken me in a couple of seasons back when work in the West had dried up and when my name had started to follow me like a bad smell. My brother was a different story. He had a knack for walking away from consequences and a habit of expecting me to make everything right. He'd called a month earlier, voice smooth and careless, and left me instructions that sounded like promises disguised as convenience. "Don't ask," he'd said, "this will sort itself, send money." He liked the word opportunity like it was a cure and used it to frame anything that might fatten his wallet. He always finished with the same line, "You're the man who gets things done," and expected my hands to do the work while his conscience stayed light. So I came out here instead. The Marree run had no illusions about my past or my future, but it did have steady work, cash when needed, and a boss who didn't ask questions he didn't mean to hear the answers to. Money troubles were blunt and constant in a town like this. You fix an alternator, and you buy a week of food for the crew. You rebuild a pump, and you keep stock alive. That usefulness was a kind of camouflage. People tolerated me because I fixed leaks. They didn't have to trust me otherwise. It suited me that way, until I saw the tire tracks and felt like someone had pulled a thread and everything might unravel. The line cut between keeping the station steady and pulling at curiosity was thin, and I could feel both its edges. The road to the Marree Roadhouse was barely more than a suggestion on the map, a fat sun-baked line and a place that served fuel, pies and gossip. The roadhouse itself sat with an indifferent patience that only places that have seen heat can claim: corrugated iron, a sagging shade, a diesel pump that took coins sideways. When I drove in at first light, the flies had already set up like a jury on the grill of the ute. Steam rose off coffee tins, and the smell of frying meat threaded the air like a promise. Mick was half a mile out on the track when I saw him, leaning on his knee and squinting at the Marree Man like he'd been memorizing him for years. He'd been out the night before checking the southern mains after a line fault, and his hat was low enough to shade most of his face. He gave me a look when I killed the engine that was both assessment and question. Tracks? He asked without waiting for the small talk. Fresh, I said. Came straight to the figure. Mick rubbed the bridge of his nose as if he'd been pinched by something more than the sun. Good, he said, and the word had a tone that didn't belong to gratitude. Behind him the figure spread across the plain, spear angled like a paused throw, arm like a straight horizon. Kate introduced herself with a firm handshake and a clipboard like a shield. She was an ARC-funded archaeologist on a survey swing through the desert, and she looked as if she'd spent half her life in seminar rooms and the other half in dusty field camps. Her hair was short and sensible, sunburn had edged her nose pink, and her boots wore the mud of long travel. Her four-wheel drive had a university sticker, and Marree arms, the word survey unit across it in letters that made Mick bristle. "You're the man who found the tracks?" she asked, neutral and direct. "Yeah," I said. "Came out with Mick." She peered at the tire marks and at the Marree Man like she was checking to see if a protagonist fit her storybook. "This is a rich place," she said. "Big geoglyphs get used for other things. People think they're only drawings, but humans don't draw for no reason." Mick grunted. He did not like experts. He liked people who could turn up, fix the gate or mend a pump and keep their mouths shut about reasons. "Or people don't like digging where they shouldn't," he said. "If you start prodding up everything that looks suspicious, you'll be upsetting more than dust." Kate's fingers found a taped notebook on her clipboard, and she read a name off it. "I'm not here to upset pasture," she said. "I'm running a survey. If there are anomalies, if Earth's been moved, I will record it properly." She worked the words like she was setting up a tent, slow, sure and purposeful. Mick's mouth tightened. "Protocols don't feed cattle, Kate," he said. "I'm not looking to take stuff," she replied. "I'm looking to document. If there's something under the Marree Man that shouldn't be there, it belongs to the record." "Right to know," Mick echoed with a scoff, and you could hear what the thought opened in him. Lawyers, cameras, strangers, lecturing country people about care. There was a skitter of unspoken history in his tone, and we've both seen how curious strangers pull towns apart. Mick believed the land had manners and memory, and that some things, when left alone, caused fewer troubles. Kate believed history belonged in the open, and that paper could catch truth better than silence ever could. I sat on the tailgate and watched them circle each other, two different kinds of conviction trying to tidy the air. Kate had that professional patience born of committees and grant applications. Mick had a caution carved by loss and old debts. Sometimes the two alignments collide, and people get hurt. I felt the pull then, an ethical tide with Kate on one bank and Mick on the other. "Who had access out here at night?" Kate asked, softer now, looking toward me. "People come through," I said. "Tourists, commercial teams, farmers. We see visitors." But these tracks weren't tourists. They knew where they were going. "Which means they could come back," she said. "And someone else might not want them to," Mick answered. The choice felt small at first, and then heavy like a bolt in a fence post. Dig and expose, or leave it stitched. I could fix the busted water tank and keep to the ledger of practicalities and let the tracks be. Or I could help Kate and record and maybe dig a little, and in doing so change things for the town and the people who lived there. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was duty with multiple currencies: work, reputation, debt, and the safety of neighbors. I told them I'd think about it, which was both truth and prevarication. Mick huffed as if I'd told him I'd be stealing cattle, and Kate took it as a promise. She left me a business card with ink that had bled in the heat. Mick lit a cigarette and watched the smoke like a man counting time. I drove back to the station with the Marree Man behind me, and the morning bending toward heat, the tracks still an itch in my head. That afternoon we dug on the downwind side, where the sand held less baked clay and the spade sank like a key sliding into a lock. Kate marked the perimeter with survey tape and a battered aluminium rod she found in the ute. Mick refused to touch the tape, but hovered with a cigarette, and that old man's authority folded into posture. I set the shovel rhythm like a mechanic, each scoop a measure of time, and a way to keep the worrying brain from racing. The soil shifted under our boots like a palimpsest. Tracks and wind and burials layered over each other. Kate found the first anomaly. A patch of earth darker than its surrounds, the white salt crust missing where the shovel bit in. The scoop came up with dust that smelled of oil and old paper and made my throat catch. We cleared until a corner of something hard showed, and the noise of the place seemed suddenly too loud. When the rectangular metal case slid free and settled on the tarpaulin with a sound like a coffin closing, we all breathed at once. It was battered and field issue, with a hinge stained to the color of old bone and latches eaten by corrosion. Someone had rubbed the paint off one corner in a long finger swipe, leaving it raw and darker than the rest. I lay a hand on the lid and felt the obscene warmth of an object that had been somewhere it shouldn't. "Don't," Mick said more to himself than to us, as if his voice alone could put the lid back underground. Kate wiped dirt from the top with the sleeve of her shirt and said, "We map it, tag it, photograph it, then open." "Photographs," I agreed, because my hands were already as dirty as anyone's, and you never refuse a woman 3 steps ahead in a project she believes in. We took pictures with a field phone and a battered camera, Kate mapping the case against the geoglyph like a geologist tracing a seam. The lid creaked when she forced it, and something brittle inside gave a soft, sad sigh. On top lay a square of paper folded until the creases were continents, and when she unfolded it, she moved like a man breaking an oath. Inside were black and white photographs tied with a fraying rubber band, a brittle newspaper clipping, and a letter whose hand slanted like a peninsula. Beneath the paper, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a torn map fragment with a crude sketch of the Marree Man. The photographs showed men in heavy coats that didn't belong in this climate, men with collars turned up, grins like they had secrets to themselves. One photo showed the Marree Man newly cut, bright ridges of displaced dirt. Someone had circled a point near the figure's ankle in pen. The clipping was from the 1960s and its headline read, "Test site established, government says no hazard." The letter inside was short and clipped and shy of apologies. It spoke of science at the edge, and of moves that were not simply rocks. "Document that something is buried beneath the southern knee for retrieval in 20 years, it said, and in the margin someone had scrawled Site 47S. A stamped note read, "Do not disclose. Retrieval scheduled 1986. We sat with a secret not yet named between us and the wind folding around the tarpaulin." Kate's jaw worked, and her fingers smelled of sun and science in a way that made her look younger and more fierce at once. Mick's cigarette had burned down to a nub and he flung it with neat anger. "You saw that," Kate said. "Those coordinates aren't on public charts." "No record," I answered, my voice thick as bad fuel. Mick looked at the map fragment and out across the Marree Man like someone recollecting a wound. "We shouldn't have found that," he said. "Some things get left alone for a reason." "You mean because it's dangerous?" Kate asked. "No," Mick said slowly, "because people forget. And when they forget, you can make a mess getting it back." The letter pinched something in me I didn't know was tender, and the 2 instincts I carried, obedience and the need to fix, pulled in different directions. My brother's voice flickered in the back of my skull, reminding me of money, threats, and deals. A secret like this was a kind of currency, not neat, and not always to be measured in dollars, but leverage all the same. Kate folded the letter back with the careful fingers of someone used to brittle things. "We should follow this," she said. "There are archives labs. This is a lead." Mick spat a little in the dust and said, "Leads get you whiskey and strangers. Questions bring men with suits who've had more practice in denial than you have in asking." We decided to take photographs and notes to the roadhouse, because paperwork gives you an excuse to put distance between a hot decision and the town. On the drive back, the Marree Man watched us like something enormous and indifferent. The case and the maps were a question that had to be fed into bureaucracy, and bureaucracy either flushed you with paperwork or stopped you with polite refusals. In town, Harris pulled up with the slow authority of a cop who'd learned to keep the edges smooth. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the spread on the tarpaulin like it was both evidence and a family heirloom. His face didn't change at the photographs or the clipping or the map. That flatness hit harder than a shout. "You're poking into old work," he said finally, "old work that wasn't ours to start with." Kate moved to speak, but he raised a hand and the silence became a thing under his control. "Officially," Harris said, "there's no record of anything out here besides sheep and the odd survey mark. If you flash these things around, someone will nod and tell you to be reasonable and then go to people who aren't so reasonable," he warned. "Less reasonable how?" Mick asked, his voice trembling just a hair. Harris's mouth tightened, and he said, "Privatized security, contractors with reputations you don't want to meet, or agencies who give orders and then pretend they didn't." He left without taking the case, but his implication hung, Official denial isn't safety. Night came as a clean cut, and the air inverted to cold like a trapdoor. I slept poorly thinking of the case, and the ways old decisions settle under the land. At 2 in the morning the dog woke me with a low watchful growl, and I put my boots on because dogs hear things you don't. The ute waited where I'd left it, but the tailgate hung wrong. The driver's side tire was a black, snaking mouth where air used to be. Someone had used a blade precise and quick. Not a robbery, Mick cursed, but immobilization, done to strand someone and buy time. Footprints led away toward the Marree Man. They were narrow, duck-like and neat, with a tread I recognized from one of the photographs. We sat up until the east colored the sky in a blunt pink, lantern between us and the wide dark. It felt stupid and necessary to watch something that might not come back. I thought of my brother's old line about not picking fights you can't win, and of what winning meant when the enemy was silence. The next morning old Sid came down from the ridge carrying a cup of tea and the patience of one who remembers seasons more than headlines. He sat with us by the roadhouse wall and talked without preamble about why they carved the thing we called the Marree Man. "You know why they carved that thing?" he asked. And he didn't wait for an answer. Kate said, "Because it's a geoglyph, to mark something, to be seen." Sid laughed small and said, "Seen by planes and men with money, but you lot drive past and call it art." He told us the place had been used to mark spots for men with tests, and for things they didn't want the broad public to see. In the 60s a lot of how we'd do it came down the track, he said. They dug, they buried, they painted a man in the dirt to hide a sign. Mick's face tightened. Sid's words put a bin over the land and its history for some men who came and went. Kate leaned forward and asked bluntly, "Do you know what they buried?" Sid looked at the Marree Man in a way I hadn't seen anyone else do and said, "Not exactly. Some things you hear, some things you remember." He spoke of rockets and chemicals and experiments that were too keen to be left in laboratories, and of men who said it was safe. "People come afterwards and call it safe," he said. "People forget the full stop doesn't mean all the mistakes were cleaned up." His warning settled over us like weather. We could follow paper where it led, or we could accept the land's polite amnesia. I thought then of the responsibilities I had. Family, the station, the ledger of day-to-day needs, and of options that demanded a price. Sid looked at me like a man, expecting an answer he believed I might not give. We began a patient chase of paper and memory. Kate worked the university archives with a purpose, cross-checking names from the letter, and the case against project logs and memos. She said A.G. Reeves Rook Research Station, Project Janus, early 60s. I handed her the map fragment, and the initials scribbled in the metal lid, H. Corbett Field Ops. She dug through brittle requisition forms, and found references to forward caches, calibration runs, and single-use dispersal kits. A stamped classified had been refiled by someone with a conscience in the 70s, and we'd found Corbett's name. There were motion-blurred images in a box at the State Library of men setting out cans on a ridge, dates 1962 to 1964, and the words next to a photo read, "Instrumented tracer, non-reactive formulation." Someone had written in pencil, "All returned, no contamination recorded." The paper trail led to Port Augusta, and to a contractor named Lyle Mercer, who remembered packing crates and counting boxes and seeing Reeves' sign forms. He told us over a beer that they were told to make a sign so pilots didn't miss it. Whenever we turned a page and found a name, Sid phoned. His voice on my phone wasn't pleading, it was a claim. "Don't," he said the night we found Corbett's memos. "You think you're doing the right thing, but you don't know what you're waking." He already seemed to have chosen his side, practical survival over any abstract truth. That made him the antagonist in the clean moral way life sometimes forces men to be. He preferred private security to public ledger. We dug again with more care, and a permit filed under archaeological survey to buy a narrow legal window. We had gloves and tarps and Harris wandering close enough to look like a polite presence. Under the case we found layers, a round canister, and inside it, ampoules with pale dusty residue clinging like ash. Some were stamped Tracer AN/7, some PERCL, stay above, and one had been marked plainly, "Do not open." "This isn't just telemetry," Kate said, reading labels as if they were a foreign language becoming familiar. "Perchlorate is used in rocket oxidizers. Tracers track plumes. If the stabilizers were mixed or if simulations were used, it can persist in the environment." My chest hollowed at the thought, men setting out plumes across a plane to watch how things moved and leaving the instruments behind. The map had been a signpost for retrieval. The retrieval, if it happened, had not happened for us. We wrapped the ampoules in inner boxes, and Kate argued quietly to ship them to Adelaide, with a cold chain and proper permits. Containment meant forms, and waiting and telling more people. It meant stirring the ledger Mick wanted left alone. Sid's response came in a voicemail, practical and cold. If you drag them back, you'll make enemies you can't afford. That night, someone slashed the Utes' rear tire in the dark, with precise ease. The scrape of blade across rubber was a punctuation mark in our lives that tasted of threat. You slashed tires to immobilize, not to steal, and we all understood the meaning of immobilization. We watched the Marree Man like a sentinel while the tire was changed, and I thought about my brother and his hunger for easy solutions. We moved the material at night with furtive choreography because the ampoules had to reach a lab with appropriate containment. We loaded the case into the back of the Ute under tarps and dragged our own reluctance into the vehicle with us. Sid watched from the veranda, and when he came to the tailgate, he wouldn't let it close. He put his hands on the lid, and his fingers were clammy and small and absurdly strong. "You'll get us all into trouble," he whispered. "And you're going to keep us safe?" I asked, voice low in the night. He reached toward me like he wanted to stop the engine, and his face was a map of men who had gone quieter as things got rougher. Mick stepped between us and told Sid to leave it be. The world compressed into a single decision, and in that compression, the men in the dark stepped out from behind the roadhouse. They weren't locals. Their jackets had the cut of suits and contractors who expect to be obeyed. One had a camera like a badge. The other moved with the quick hands of someone used to closing things down. "You're making this messy," the man in the dark jacket said, voice practiced in the language of authority. I should have been calmer than I was and probably said fewer things. Instead, I stepped forward with the case under my arm and said, "These belong to the land. If they're dangerous, they belong to the people who might be harmed." The man smiled with the smugness of someone used to taking custody. "They belong to the department," he said flatly. Sid surprised me by stepping into the little ring between us and the men. "You want money?" he asked, voice dry. "You want to pay me off?" The man with the camera laughed short and said they didn't pay for silence, they extracted it. It was an offer of practical corruption, and Sid made himself into a ledger entry that evening. Words turned into motion, and motion turned into a fight as the man lunged for the case. Fists moved and a camera hit dirt, and I tasted copper in my mouth, and the night sounded like something very small breaking. The case popped open when it hit the ground, and a vial rolled free and cracked underfoot like a brittle promise. White powder puffed up, and the men inhaled in a beat too late to avoid panic. Harris came running, gun out and face set, the kind of clear apparatus the law provides its own surprise with. For a breath, everyone stopped. Mick, my brother, the men with the jackets, Kate and me. The strangers shifted from predatory to bureaucratic, as if they'd rehearsed the pivot. "Department oversight," one of them said, and produced official phrases like talismans. Harris asked who authorized them, and the man with the camera said they had standing orders, and that they would take custody as remediation. The words smelt like laundering to me and like procedure to them. They put the case and the powder into a larger crate, documented it with cameras and written forms, and left like men who'd finished tidying a problem. We watched them go with the sense that we'd been outmaneuvered by the procedures of people with more resources. Sid stayed behind and watched them leave with a face that read like a ledger balancing itself. When he turned to me, he said, "You could have given them the damn thing." "I couldn't," I replied, "not without making the town collateral." He accused me of thinking I was a hero and then of not thinking enough about the price of truth. We argued in the dark, and the town's sky held on to the sound of our voices like it kept blood in the ground. He'd taken a side I'd tried to live between, and in stepping across he'd made his choice. He left the yard that night with the practical bluntness he'd always applied to life, and gave me a line I would chew on for months. "You think truth is worth more than my kids' safety." There were days after when the formalities began to move as slowly as wet paint. Kate got lab results back that said perchlorates were present, and traces of radioactive isotopes showed up in the analysis. The report that arrived was careful and bureaucratic and used the phrase legacy contamination. The lab suggested monitoring of groundwater and cautioned about long-term risks. We had paper, chain of names from Rook to Cerulean to contractors, and a lab that matched notations in Reeves' file. We had evidence and not just rumor. That made a difference. But what to do with it was a question that involved the town, the department, and men who preferred silence. Kate wanted to make it official, and remediation seemed the right phrase to her, like a cure in process. My brother called more, and bargaining replaced threats with offers and cajoling. "If you go public, they'll take everything," he said. "They'll declare hazard, drag Marree through hearings, and they'll take your home." Mick wanted stability for his station, and begged me to delay, to find a middle way we could live with. Harris said, "Be careful, because if you make enemies of the department, they'll bury you, and find reasons to charge you." I chose truth, despite the cost, and I did it, without ceremony. I signed a statement, copied files and lab reports, and hit send to a regional journalist, a university contact, and an environmental watchdog. I wrote what we'd found and where, and attached everything like a man dropping a match in dry grass. I didn't expect fireworks, and I didn't want them. I expected bureaucracy to do what it does, and to move the problem from our hands to someone else's. The fallout came small and sharp. The contractor called and his voice was polite and cold. Sid's rage turned into a distance I could feel in the stares of neighbors. Mick lost a long-stay client, who decided proximity to an unresolved department incident meant risk. The journalist wrote a piece that was clean and methodical, and the department replied in careful sentences that acknowledged legacy operations and promised investigation. The men in jackets evaporated from the highway, and the vans were gone without ceremony. People were angry at me for the attention, and grateful in secret to Kate for her persistence. There were hearings, forms, and perhaps the most important thing, a public acknowledgement. It was a hollow victory in many ways. You don't fight quiet threats with paperwork and come out untouched. I received a thin legal threat from a private security firm and a photograph of me grabbing the case with metadata stamped on it. That was the sort of thing that turns public ledger into personal liability. But there were consequences that went both ways. The department began monitoring, and a small pot of emergency money funded baseline testing. Kate's name shifted in her field, and she got funding to keep surveys going. We put up orange flags, and men in white overalls came, and they did things that looked like respect, taking cores and logging samples, and measuring with the slow precision of people paid to be patient. Those flags looked obscene to some. A geoglyph had become a worksite, and that hurt pride. We had bores tested, and a contractor lined up a containment plan, and the council set in motion an application for grants to help station owners. The change was less a moment than a process of small administrative acts and a slow turn toward repair. The worst fallout was personal. Sid moved his family away for a while and stopped answering my calls. He accused me of choosing truth over kin, and in some ways he was right. He wanted the safety of secrecy, and had always been a man who calculated the price of silence. My brother left too in his own quiet way. He packed a trailer, and the chainsaw he used to sharpen posts, and drove off with the kind of economy only men who've made a life of practical choices understand. He left a note that said, "Keep the station clean, keep the fences mended." It wasn't forgiveness. It was a practical instruction in a world that no longer matched either of our plans. The town adjusted the way small towns do, with practical gestures and an occasional brutal honesty. We had more forms and some money for repairs, and a monitoring program that gave work to local men for a while. The station kept going because people pitched in, not because one man kept the books in his head anymore. I learned to do paperwork, and to talk plainly at council meetings about bores and monitoring and long-term surveillance. There were nights when I lay awake and counted the things I'd traded. Sleep, a measure of reputation, ease at the servo, against the ledger I'd opened for public view. I had not been heroically wise. I had been tired of keeping secrets that might harm other people in the long run. You pay a private price for public truth, and sometimes that price is the loss of a brother. Sid's mail came on occasion with nothing written. A postcard with no message, like a man who had chosen absence. The department's official response was mixed and bureaucratic. They admitted historical tests were run. They promised to fund monitoring and to put in place remediation plans. They didn't admit culpability in a way that would satisfy revenge or closure. They promised instead the slow economy of forms and tenders and budgets, and the slow mechanical kindness of process. In that quiet machinery of policy, the Marree Man changed shape in the community mind. Maps were redrawn to include a note, known activities, ongoing monitoring required. The geoglyph stopped being just a tourist oddity, and became a site with a history and a responsibility attached. Scientists came, and the town started to use words like baseline data and containment with a new fluency. Kate came back once in the winter to check the monitoring progress, and we sat on the tailgate of the ute at dusk and watched the figure grow darker against the sky. "You gave them a chance to do the right thing," she said, and meant the practical work of documentation and remediation. "You think the right thing will be done?" I asked. "It has to be," she replied, "not because anyone was noble, but because somebody needs to keep doing it." The men in white overalls left a notebook with the council clerk, who knew how to hold sensitive things in a drawer and only pull them out on the right kind of day. The elder came in and dropped a stone at the base of the glyph and said, "You did a hard thing." He never said I was right, and he would not have used the word courage. He meant only this: the ledger had been shifted, and some costs would follow. The town's ledger did change in a way that made practical work possible. A monitoring contract gave wages to blokes who would otherwise have headed south in search of work. The grant for bore repairs kept a family business alive. The station, without my brother's particular kind of keeping, adapted because the community was used to pitching in. There was a period when people came around asking where originals were kept, and checking sheds and bins like they were gathering proof. Vandalism kept happening in a minor, spiteful way. Tires slashed, notes left that read like threats. Harris watched the horizon and said nothing more than, "You did what you thought right, but be careful. Not everyone measures consequences like you do." It was his way of saying he respected my choice and feared what it would bring. Kate left eventually for another job up north, and she left behind a folder of anonymized outcomes and contacts for grants and monitoring. Mick stayed and kept the station moving and learned the paperwork I never thought I'd touch. He sat at council meetings and spoke plainly about money and bores and the expense of monitoring. His slow loyalty made things bearable. The men in jackets who'd packaged the case into crates and driven away remained absent from official pages. The department's statement never named them, and their vans were gone. That absence said more than words. Responsibility was a complicated weave between public acknowledgement and private power. Time, the slow mechanic, did its work. Monitoring bores were installed, regular sample rounds happened, and data built up lines on graphs that told slow stories of persistence. In the margin of those graphs, our town found a ledger to consult and a process to keep. The work made the Marree Man into a marker for repair as much as for history. I lost a job offer in a town that decided men with trouble should be left to their own mending. I lost friends who thought I should have been more pragmatic, and I gained people who wanted to know what had been done on their land. I slept poorly for months, hearing in my mind the hiss of a vial breaking in sand, and the soft noise of the men in the jackets leaving at night. Sid sent postcards with nothing written, and a letter months after he left that said, in practical pen, "Keep the station clean." There was no melodrama in my brother's leaving, no weeping phone calls or cinematic reconciliations. He left with a kind of practical kindness only men who are prideful can give, and it filled me with equal parts grief and acceptance. He'd chosen to live with secrecy, and the life that came with it. I had chosen a different ledger. It was, in the end, two sensible men picking different ways to manage risk. The town's record had changed, and that one line can do more than any speech can. A council minute noted the site's history, and a small amount of money trickled through to the monitoring program. The environmental team ran more tests and left placards that read like apologies and warnings. The Marree Man remained under the sky, but now stood over stakes and notes, a memorial and a warning both. I learned a different anatomy of responsibility. It's not a tidy thing you cross off the list. It's a direction you choose to walk, and keep walking along. You tell the truth, and then you do the tedious, dull, and necessary work that follows. Apply for funds, fix fences, monitor bores. That kind of labor is not romantic, but it is durable, and it kept the town moving in a new way. The elder's words that the land remembers differently than we do stuck with me, and softened into something less like a motto, and more like a practice. The land held the canisters, and the tire tracks, and the layers of the past, and it kept them whether we liked it or not. We had only changed the ledger. Now the record said that somebody had used this ground for tests, and that the town was watching. On evenings when the figure lay long and flat and the sun thinned into gold, I would stand beneath the Marree Man and think of what I'd chosen. I had traded personal safety and the easy favor of silence for a public ledger that might protect future children who'd play on the plain. I had not won a great moral victory. I'd done what I could to make sure people knew the whole argument. The practical work continued. Monitoring, grant applications, and the slow bureaucracy of healing land. There were times when funds stalled and men grumbled about outsiders measuring soil. There were other times when scientific data gave us an argument we could use at council, and with agencies that had budgets. The town learned to speak in new phrases like baseline and long-term surveillance, and to apply for the money that made repair possible. Sometimes I drove out to the figure and sat on the tailgate with a thermos mix Mrs. had filled and listened to the wind move like a hand over saltbush. Kate came back once, we swapped notes, and she said quietly, "You did the right thing." I didn't know if I had done the right thing beyond the small fact it had been done. Doing it had a weight that I felt in my pocket, where lab reports and paperwork sat like a small, stubborn ledger. The Marree Man now had placards and stakes, and a ring of orange flags that gave way to subtle posts and technical signs. The site had become a patient chart, and those who cared for it had to come back and take readings and write them down like nurses. The work was mechanical and boring and necessary, and that steadiness suited me. There are people who still think I overreached. There are others who came into their own sense of being when they had a record, and not just a memory. Sid moved on with his choices, and I respected him enough to leave him to them. My brother kept his practical economy and sent a note weeks later that was neither apology nor reconciliation. The ledger we opened up continues to be a ledger in motion, requiring tending and money and patience. The town's map has changed to include a caution, and that makes it harder for anyone to pretend nothing happened. It makes it harder for a closed network of men to bury evidence again without someone seeing the annotation. If there is a lesson I can own, it is this: telling the truth is not an act that ends with a sentence. It is a first step that obliges you to keep walking, to pay for the work, and to accept the personal costs that come with doing the right thing in a small place. You fix fences, you file reports, you answer awkward questions at council meetings, and you live with the choices your honesty makes. Some nights I think I might have been better staying out of it and letting the land's forgetting protect us. But when I watch the kids line up on their bikes at the edge of the survey stakes now, when I see orange flags no longer flapping but serving as the outline of a careful margin, I feel like the ledger I put into motion does keep people safer. I don't expect thanks, and I don't expect my brother to come home and shake my hand. I expect only that the town will keep a record and that records make future action possible. When the sun cut the Marree Man into sharper shadow and I walked back toward the road, I felt the small, stubborn, heavy honesty of the folders in my pocket. They represented decisions I had made and the cost I'd paid. I had chosen to make the town see its past, and to force an accounting that would need money and patience to follow through. If you want to hear more about the places where the land keeps its secrets, and about the kinds of choices that reshuffle family and town ledgers, follow along. There are more roads in this country, more shadows, and more things the Outback keeps in its quiet memory. I'll tell you what I find.